Hello folks, welcome back for Chapter 3, The Doom of the Planet Tamaran. As Lucy continued with her story, she said that 6,000 years ago at the other end of the galaxy, there was a system called the Dax system, and at the centre of this system was a star called Toxmaia. The Dax system was made up of 5 planets, and one of these was the planet Tamaran, which was the second planet out from its star. Tamaran was orbited by 2 moons called Spoffe and Hoffe, and the strange thing about these moons was that they orbited Tamaran at opposite sides of the planet. As a result of this, no matter where on the planet you were standing, and no matter what time of the day or night it was, if you looked up you could always see a moon visible in the Tamaran sky, and also on 3 separate occasions each year, you could see both moons visible in the sky at the same time. And of these moons, Spoffe was easily the largest of the 2. As for the other 4 planets, these were Dimor, which had 1 moon, Celtic, which also had 1 moon, Dorf, again with 1 moon, and Jaga, which like Tamaran had 2 moons. The planet nearest to Toxmaia was Dorf, and together with Tamaran made up the system's inner planets, and the 3 other planets, of which Celtic was the furthest away from Toxmaia, made up the outer planets. Also, like Earth's solar system, the inner planets were rocky planets, whereas the outer planets were gas giants. The planet Tamaran had at one time been home to many different races, but now there is only 3 left, and the first of these is the Mimitex, whose name in English translates as Mimi people. This is because the first part of their name, which is taken from their most reverend goddess, who is said to have brought her people to Tamaran, is Mine, and in their language, the Tech part of their name means people. The other 2 races are the Delitex and the Militex, who had originally been called the Deligots and the Millirofs, and these 2 races had been enemies for as long as anyone could remember, and apart from when the Mimitex intervened, they had been continuously at war with each other, and they had often dragged many of the smaller tribes into their ongoing conflict. And as usually happens when a smaller group joins a much larger group in battle, they are often treated as cannon fodder, with the result that these people are usually the first to be killed. And so over the centuries, apart from a few isolated pockets, these smaller nations are now all gone. One interesting fact about the Mimitex is that they are not originally from Tamaran, but had first come to the planet many thousands of years ago, and in fact it is now that long since they arrived that no one knows where they originally came from, or even what kind of a disaster it was that forced the Mimitex to leave in the first place. It is only recorded that their planet was dying, and so they had no choice but to leave. And now not even the Mimitex historians can tell you why they left. What they can tell you is that when the Mimitex first arrived on Tamaran, the Delitex and the Militex were at a very early stage in their respective developments, which was about the same stage as when the people of Earth were living in what today's historians refer to as the Bronze Age. Because the Delitex and Militex were at this early stage of their development, the Mimitex had the advantage of being far more superior in their technology and intellect, and so they tended to avoid them. That was until their warring became a threat to the Mimitex way of life. Then they would intervene to stop the fighting, and it was during one of these interventions that the Mimitex persuaded the Deligots and the Millirofs to change their names to Delitec and Militec, respectively. And the idea behind this was that the Mimitex hoped that this change of name would give the Delitex and Militex a sense of common identity, and so put a stop to the fighting permanently. However, I regret to say that this did not happen, and as we will see, they continued with their war until the bitter end. When the Mimitex first arrived on the planet, there had been hundreds of land masses of various sizes and climate type. Regrettably, these days, however, the planet now only has 4 major land masses left, and even one of these is on the verge of collapsing back into the Southern Ocean. Of these remaining land masses, the northern landmass, named Plutona, has a temperate climate similar to Europe on Earth and is home to the Mimitech race. The central landmass, named Sumpak, has a tropical climate similar to Africa and is home to the Delitech race. And the southern landmass, named Bigon, like the northern landmass, has a temperate climate but is more akin to Australia than it is to Europe, and it is home to the Militech race. The fourth landmass is an island called the Isle of Ghosts by the locals, but its real name is Bora de Bora, and it is located 200 kilometres south of Bigon. It is more commonly known as the Island of Ghosts because many centuries ago there was a plague of some sort, and before help could arrive, many of the island's inhabitants had thrown themselves off its high cliffs rather than face the consequences of catching that terrible disease. And so some say that on those nights when the moon of Spoffe is at its highest point in the sky, you can hear the cries of those poor, unfortunate people. But others say it's just the wind blowing through the holes in what is left of the cliffs. Because over the years there has been very little integration between the Mimitex and the other 2 races, the Mimitex have been able to retain their own distinctive Mimitech identity, which has resulted in the Mimitex continuing to be superior in both their technology and their intellect. And as a result of this, they still hold the upper hand when it comes to mediating between the Delitex and the Militex. Also, because of this lack of integration between any of the tribes, all 3 were completely different in appearance to each other. That said, each of the 3 races are humanoid in appearance in that they have 2 arms, 2 legs and a head. But as I say, that is where the similarity ends. The Mimitech people are on average much taller than the other 2 races. For example, a Mimitech male tends to be between 177 centimetres and 193 centimetres tall, and a Mimitech female tends to be between 170 centimetres and 180 centimetres tall. Whereas both the Delitech males and the Mimitech males are normally between 142 centimetres and 163 centimetres tall. And unlike the Mimitex, their females tend to be a centimetre or so taller than the males. Also, as is the case when a people move to a new country, or in this case a new world, the older generation tend to cling to their old traditions, especially their language, and so many of the Mimitech traditionalists will still only speak the Mimitech language. That said, to a certain extent, all 3 races now speak the same language, which strangely enough contains a lot of words that are very similar to English. Nonetheless, there are many differences between the spoken language of each race. So much so that a person who is blind could tell you which race a person belongs to just by hearing him or her speak a few words. An example of this on Earth would be, say, the difference between an American and an Englishman, in that they both speak English, but many of the things they talk about have different words for the same thing, i.e., the Englishman would say lift, whereas the American would say elevator. Also, each race has its own distinct accent. For example, the Mimitex have a very strong accent, which sounds very similar to a person from the north of Scotland, whereas the Delitex accent sounds very similar to a person born in South Africa, and the Militech accent sounds very similar to a person who was born in Australia. With regards to their appearance, the Maimitech male has a long face with a high forehead and normal human type ears. Also, their face has a rather distinctive bony ridge-like structure which runs down either side of the nose, and even though this ridge is very obvious close up, because it is the same colour as the rest of the face, it is not so noticeable from a distance. Maimitech females, on the other hand, do not have this facial ridge, and because of this you might find it hard to distinguish between them and any female from Earth, if not for one small difference, and that is that Maimitech females, unlike Maimitech males, have long pointed elf-like ears. Another difference between Maimitech males and females is to do with their hair, in that all males have no hair on the top of their head, but have a band of hair which starts just below the scalp line and ends just above the shoulders. And this band runs from just in front of the left ear all the way around the back of the head and ends just in front of the right ear. Maimitech females, on the other hand, have a full head of hair, which in most cases tends to be shoulder length and wavy. Also, just like on Earth, the males tend to have a deeper pitch to their voices than the females. And as for their overall appearance, the Maimitechs look completely different to the Delitechs and Militechs in both skin type and build, in that the Maimitechs have very smooth skin without any marks or blemishes. And as for their build, they tend to be slim, or what you might even call skinny. Also, unlike the other two races, they tend to live to at least 200. One final difference in appearance that sets the Maimitechs apart from the other two races is that, like some humans on Earth, some Maimitechs have bright orange spots similar to freckles, which runs in a band just below the eyes, but is more common among the females than it is among the males. The reason for this difference in appearance between the Maimitechs and the other two races is that, as I say, over the centuries since the Maimitechs first arrived on Tamaron, they had always kept themselves apart from all the other races, and so still look exactly as they did when they first arrived. The Delitechs and Militechs, on the other hand, are completely different in appearance, not only to the Maimitechs but also to each other. Although at one time the Delitechs and Maimitechs had looked very similar to each other, and the reason why they no longer looked similar to each other is because whenever they conquered one of the smaller tribes, they integrated them into their tribe, which over the centuries had the effect of changing the appearance of each of these two tribes forever. The result of these changes is that the Delitechs now have an oval-shaped face with a low forehead and have a wide, dark, bony ridge-like structure running all the way around the skull, starting from just behind the left ear and ending just behind the right ear. And the area above this ridge is denuded of hair, apart from a small strip that runs from the front of the head to the back and is similar to what we on Earth call a Mohican cut. I should add that this is not by choice, you understand, but it is just the way their hair grows. This bony ridge-like structure is not present in either the Delitech males or females during their first 10 years, and is in fact what we on Earth call the first signs of puberty. Also, Delitech females have a much less pronounced ridge than the males do, so much so that it tends to be unnoticeable under their long hair. The Delitech male has deep-set black eyes with human-type eyelids and has a narrow slit nose, but instead of nostrils at the bottom of the nose, they have small slits on either side. The Delitech females, on the other hand, have deep-set yellow eyes, and unlike the males, they have eyelids that blink together like opening and closing a set of curtains. Also, they do not have human ears like the males, but instead have small slits in the side of the neck. Also, unlike the Mimitex, the Delitex skin is very rough to the touch, and their build is what you might call thick set, but is still all muscle, you understand. The Militex also have a oval-shaped face and a pronounced dark bony facial ridge, but their ridge runs from just above the left ear slit in a vertical line up to the temple, then horizontally across the face just below the scalp line and back down to just above the right ear slit, and this feature is present in both males and females. Militech females have a full head of hair, and for some unknown reason, the Militech males only have hair which is thick and bushy on the top of their head and none on the back or sides. Both Militech males and females have green eyes and both have the same type of eyelids as the Delitech females have. But unlike the Delitex, the Militech male as well as the females have ear slits instead of ears. And as with the Delitex, the Militex facial ridge is less pronounced with the female of the species. As for the Militech children, like the Delitex, they do not develop their facial ridges until they reach puberty. In fact, until they reach puberty, it is difficult to tell the two races apart. As well as these differences in appearance that exist between each of the three races, there are also a number of things which they have in common, such as each race has different skin colours depending on which part of the planet or landmass they live on. Also, almost everyone has either black or brown hair, with the exception of a few people who have blonde or fair hair, and this exception, for whatever reason, seems only to occur among the Mimitex females. As I have already stated, each generation of the Militex and Delitex have been, for at least the past 6,000 years, or Yarses in Mimitech, at war with each other, and this war has now gone on for that long that no one on either side can tell you why, or even who started the war in the first place. And although since that first peace conference there had been many periods of peace between the Delitex and the Militex, these periods of peace never lasted for any length of time. In fact, the longest was 3 years, and if it was not for the Mimitex stepping in whenever they felt things were getting out of hand, it's likely that the Delitex and Militex would have wiped each other out a long time ago. Considering what was about to happen, no doubt the Mimitex were now wishing they had left them to wipe each other out, because as a result of the damage done to the planet over the centuries by all this fighting, the planet was slowly reaching that tipping point where it could no longer sustain any form of life, and the Mimitex scientists, who had been carefully studying the situation for the past 75 years, had finally concluded that even if they were to stop this war permanently, things were still only going to get worse, and they had calculated that the planet was doomed to break apart in the next 25 to 30 years. The reason for this conclusion by the Mimitex scientists was because despite the Mimitex continuously warning the Delitex and Militex of the consequences that their bombs and digging of underground bunkers was having on the stability of the planet, it did little to stop the war. And so as month after month passed, the air on the planet was becoming more and more polluted, and the lightning storms that raged across the planet were becoming more and more violent. And often these storms would go on for many weeks instead of the few days which they had done previously. And of course, each side blamed the other for the deteriorating conditions. Therefore, even as the scientists had continued with their studies for the past 75 years, the Mimitex military, realizing that the inevitable doom was coming, had in secret been building a large fleet of spaceships to take their entire population to another planet and so escape the pending destruction to come. When it first became obvious to everyone that the planet was doomed and the Mimitek government discovered their military was building these spaceships, they had wanted to inform the Delitech and Militech governments about this and invite them to join them in building the ships. But the military persuaded them that this was not a good idea, as they felt that the other two races could not be trusted to keep the building of these ships a secret, which would inevitably cause unnecessary panic among all three populations. Although some among the government believed that the real reason why the military did not want to inform the other two races about this fleet of ships they were building was because they did not want the other two races to come with them to their new planet, as they knew that the Delitechs and Militechs would settle on different parts of the planet and start their fighting all over again. In the end, this decision on whether or not to invite the Delitech and Militech governments to partake in a joint shipbuilding program became academic when agents from the Mimitek Shadow Force captured two Delitech agents at one shipbuilding site and one Militech agent at another. When this information that the Delitechs and Militechs had been spying on them reached the government, it was decided to cancel the proposal of a joint shipbuilding program. But as the Delitechs and Militechs already knew about the ships, everyone agreed that there was no point in withholding the ship's plans from them. And much to the relief of the Mimitek government, when the Delitech and Militech governments were given the plans, they kept this information a secret and instead started to build their own fleet of ships to take their leaders to a place of safety, as well as those people who had the right connections, if you know what I mean. Of course, because of the spying, many of the Mimitek military still believe that neither the Delitech or Militech could be trusted, and so they had the Shadow Force continue to monitor the Delitech and Militech agents. Therefore, it was no surprise when a year later they uncovered a plan by the other two races to steal the Mimitek ships once they were built. And when the government was informed of this, they ordered Commander Masterson, who was head of the Shadow Force, to double the security at all the construction sites, with the result that not one enemy agent got anywhere near the Mimitek ships, let alone manage to steal one. The reason why the Delitechs and the Militechs had been prepared to go to these desperate lengths was because despite the Mimiteks giving him the plans for building the ships, they were still so far behind in building the ships that they feared that when the time came, they would not even have enough ships ready for those privileged few, let alone the general population. But more than this fear of not having enough ships, both the Delitechs and Militechs mistrusted the Mimiteks because they would never share their advanced technology with them, which meant they were just paranoid enough to believe that the Mimitek government had given them plans that would not work, so as to destroy their people forever. And as a result, they checked everything again and again, with the result that a single ship that should have taken 1 month to build took 10. This mistrust of the Mimiteks by the other two races was basically down to the type of government each race had, in that for as long as anyone could remember, the Delitechs had always been ruled by a military government and the Militechs by an unelected family dynasty, whereas the Mimiteks had always had a far more stable form of government because theirs was a fully elected government by its own people. It was because of this difference in the types of government that even after all these centuries, the Delitechs and Militechs were, as we say back on Earth, in the Dark Ages compared to the Mimiteks. And the reason for this was that they had spent as much time fighting their own internal factions as they did fighting each other. And as a result, they spent most of their resources on keeping their respective dictatorships in power rather than advancing their own people as a species. However, it could be said that because the Mimitek race was a much older race than the other two, then even if the Delitex and Militex had spent more of their country's resources on developing their own people, it is unlikely that this would have made any difference, owing to the fact that the Mimitex, who had been more advanced in their technology and intellectual abilities when they first arrived, had developed these abilities even further over the centuries. Therefore, it is probably why the other two races, knowing they could not take the ships by force, had opted to steal the Mimitex ships instead. Yet even as the end approached, the Delitex and Militex were still wasting their time trying to steal each other's ships, instead of simply building more ships of their own. Naturally, the Shadow Force kept their government up to date on what the Delitex and Militex were doing, but by now the Mimitex government had its own people to think about, and so they simply concentrated on protecting their own ships against sabotage. Meanwhile, as the Delitex and Militex continued with their spying games and trying to steal each other's ships, in the Mimitex city of Sangraf, the evacuation committee were holding an emergency meeting to review the government's plans to deal with the developing situation. Chancellor Morg Harman, who stood 178 centimetres tall and was unusually well built for a Mimitex, was the first to arrive, and as the rest of the group filed in behind him, he stood with his large bony hands planted squarely on his hips, staring out of the office's large reinforced window, thinking that the sky seemed much darker than normal today, and the lightning flashes appeared to be getting much more frequent. And as these thoughts flashed through his mind, he became aware that the only sound he could hear in the room was the sound of the constant tapping of the rain against the window. That was until the silence was broken by someone behind him coughing, which in turn started a number of people chatting. And in response to this break in the silence, Chancellor Harman slowly turned round to face the rest of the committee. And as he turned, he thought how, in all of his 132 years, he had never seen the weather as bad as it was today. After he paused for a moment, he stepped forward and sat down in the large high-backed chair at the head of the table. And as he did so, he said to no one in particular, "Can anyone tell me if we are any nearer to finding a planet suitable for our needs?" Seated around this table were the current members of the evacuation committee, consisting of Job Stanton, Minister of Science, Jolene Dagmar, Minister of Construction, Gan Goodson, Minister of Internal Security, Dawn Shamerson, Minister of Transport, and Minister Gil Stoneface, who was both head of the Armed Forces and Minister of Defence. In response to Chancellor Harman's question, Minister Stanton stood up and said, "Chancellor, I am pleased to inform you that after investigating hundreds of different planets, we have at last found a suitable planet that meets our needs." And even as everyone clapped at this information, Minister Stanton went on to explain that this planet is located in the Aron Galaxy and is the fourth planet out from its star. And the star is orbited by several planets, and each planet has at least one moon. Then turning to Chancellor Harman, and while the group studied the star maps laid out before them, he said, "Chancellor, the team, with your permission, of course, have agreed to name this planet Germain, after the great warrior Germain of the Sumato legend." Nodding his approval, the Chancellor smiled and said, "Permission granted, Minister Stanton." However, Fantiles and Gentiles, what is more important than giving the planet a name is what is happening with the building of the fleet, and how near are we to its completion. As Minister Stanton sat down, Minister Dagmar, who was on the Chancellor's left, stood up, and after quickly consulting her notes, she explained that so far 1,400 Star-class ships capable of holding 20,000 passengers and crew had been fully completed, and a further 600 ships which were in the advanced stages of construction, were expected to be completed within the next 50 days. When Minister Dagmar was then asked by Chancellor Harman how many ships would be needed to evacuate the whole of the Maimitech nation, again after checking her notes, she said, assuming that the Maimitech population was still holding steady at 80 million as recorded at the last census, then it will require 4,000 ships in total. I see, said Chancellor Harman, nodding, before going on to say in his best sarcastic tone, so, Minister Dagmar, let me see if I've got this right, shall we? It has taken your people so far almost 7 Yarsees to complete or part complete the first 2,000 ships. Is that correct? Yes, Chancellor, replied Minister Dagmar. Well, in that case, it seems obvious to me that if the scientists are only half right as to when the end will come, then your department, working to the current timetable, may not have completed enough ships to carry the whole of our population to the new planet when it is time to leave this planet for good. After a moment's pause, Chancellor Harman looked Jolene Dagmar straight in the eye and said, I take it by your silence that is a yes. Nodding, she said, yes, Chancellor. Then, as she shuffled her notes while wishing he would ask someone else a question, she went on to say that she promised that her team would double their efforts and the other 2,000 ships would be built on time. Still holding Jolene Dagmar in his gaze, he said, they had better be, because if they are not, it could mean us having to leave people behind, and that is not an option. Not on my watch it isn't. Then he banged his fist on the table and said, Jolene, I don't care how many other projects you have to cancel to achieve this. Just get it done. Now visibly shaken by the Chancellor's outburst and the fact that he had used her Christian name for the first time since she had known him, she tried to explain that if it became known that a number of important projects had been cancelled, it could make people start to think that there was more to this bad weather than meets the eye. Well, that's your problem, said the Chancellor. I suggest you speak to Minister Goodson about tightening up security, and remember, if we do have to leave people behind, you may well be one of them. This last remark, that she could be one of those left behind, made Jolene Dagmar wince, and she hoped that the Chancellor had made this comment in the heat of the moment and that he didn't really mean it. After taking a few moments to regain his composure, Chancellor Harman smiled and placing his hand on Jolene Dagmar's shoulder as if to say, don't worry about it. However, in the event that Minister Dagmar's team are unable to build the remaining 2,000 ships as promised, then we are going to need a contingency plan to decide on who is to get a place on one of those ships that are completed. And when someone asked him what about the others, he simply ignored the question. Now free from the Chancellor's gaze, Jolene Dagmar slumped back down into her chair, and as she did so, Morg Harman asked the group for suggestions. And after much discussion, it was finally decided that a selection should be made to fill the 28 million places that were already available on the completed ship. At this point, Minister Dagmar, who had finally regained her composure, interrupted the discussion to say that this figure of 28 million places was incorrect, because each ship required a crew of 500, which only leaves 27,300,000 places available for passengers. She went on to say that even this figure is incorrect because, owing to their importance to the future of the Maimitech race, a total of 600 places had already been allocated between the two ships for the entire government and their dependents, and the reason for not putting them all on the same ship was so that should one of the ships crash on takeoff or go missing on the journey to Germain, then the entire leadership of the Maimitech race would not be lost. And as everyone nodded their approval of this idea, Jolene Dagmar went on to add that, of course, this will further reduce the number of those places available for the general public. She went on to suggest that they should include a number of pre-selected seats for members of the armed forces and other essential services such as doctors and nurses, police, scientists, construction workers and teachers, which of course would reduce the number of places available on each ship even further. After the group agreed to accept this idea of pre-selected seats, Jolene Dagmar added that of course until those pre-selections had been completed, she was unable to say with any accuracy how many of these pre-selected places would be required, and so is unable to say how many places will still be available for everyone else. But once she had these figures, she suggested that those remaining places should be allocated to the general public by means of a lottery, and the result of the lottery should be kept secret so as not to cause panic among those who were unlucky enough not to be chosen. And these who were chosen should be informed of this at the appropriate time. When Minister Goodson asked what was the appropriate time, Chancellor Harman suggested that once the date of departure was known, and assuming that they had sufficient time, then those who had been allocated a pre-selected place should be informed 3 weeks prior to this date, and for everyone else it should be 5 days. He went on to say that when they were informed, they were to be reminded of the consequences of letting slip this information to anyone else. And when Minister Goodson asked what were these consequences, Chancellor Harman said that any breach of security on their part would result in not only themselves but also every member of their family being locked up and left behind when the evacuation began. And after asking if anyone else had anything to add, Chancellor Harman brought the meeting to a close. Over the next 4 weeks, a steady stream of pre-selections took place, and owing to the strict security imposed by Minister Goodson's people, it wasn't until a few days before the evacuation that anyone outside of those selected were aware of the pending disaster about to befall the planet. So it was that in response to a summons from Chancellor Harman at precisely 11 o'clock in the morning, and 2 years to that very day that Chancellor Harman had informed them all about the problems still to come, that members of the evacuation committee were starting to gather in the same government office. Once everyone had arrived and taken their seats, Chancellor Harman stood up and, clearing his throat, started to address the group, saying, "Femtails and Gentails, I have convened this evacuation committee to inform you that we now only 5 Darsecs to start the evacuation." And as the Chancellor made this announcement, there was a loud gasp from the assembled group, and before he could explain any further, everybody started to talk at once. After a few moments of this uproar, Chancellor Harman waved his hand at them and called for silence. And when they did not respond, he banged his fist on the table and shouted, "Everybody be quiet!" at the top of his voice. And when the noise finally died down, he went on to say that the reason for the evacuation having been brought forward within the next few days was because the scientists had just confirmed that the planet was expected to explode sometime within the next 1 to 2 weeks. "Yes, I know," Chancellor Harman said, shaking his head, as they all looked at him with an expression which said, "I thought we had more time." And as everyone sat there in silence, Mog Harman turned to face Minister Goodson and told him that all those who had been selected should now be informed, to which Gan Goodson said that they would be. Nodding, the Chancellor then said, "Gan, when you do inform them, you are to emphasise the fact that as well as this evacuation still being top secret, they only have 5 Darsecs to report to the individual pickup points, and if they are late, they will be left behind." and for the sake of security, I suggest you only use the internal security services for this task rather than the normal enforcers. The Chancellor went on to say, Gan, when your agents contact those selected, tell them that each full-grown may only bring with them 2 large cases and each kinder may only bring with them 1 large and 1 small case. And Gan, make sure your agents know that it is very important that they strictly enforce these limits. Yes, Chancellor, replied Gan Goodson. Next, the Chancellor turned to Minister Stormface and said, Commander Stormface, as head of the armed forces, I take it you have already allocated sufficient troops to guard each of the different launch sites. Yes, Chancellor, they are at least 300 troops plus their families at each site, and they have all been reminded that if anyone who has not got the correct pass gets on board the ship at their launch site, then they, along with their entire family, will lose their place on that ship, and their places will be allocated to another family from the standby list. Nodding his head in approval, Chancellor Harman turned to Jolene Dagmar and asked what was the latest figures in regard to completed ships. And in response to his question, Jolene Dagmar stood up and said that she had been in contact with the construction department 2 days ago, and she was pleased to report that the latest figures showed that they now had a total of 3,500 completed ships, which in turn means that there is now a further 42 million places available for the general population. Less, of course, those places required for the 1,050,000 people needed to crew these extra ships. Nodding, Chancellor Harman said, That's good news indeed, Minister Dagmar. Your department have done a very good job by getting as many ships completed as they have done. However, this does mean that we are still going to have to leave behind 4 million of our citizens, assuming that the census is correct and that there are still 80 million of us. Thanking the Chancellor for his praise, she went on to say that with the committee's approval, some of these extra places were to be allocated to any construction worker along with their family who had not already been offered a pre-selected place. And as the Chancellor nodded and said, of course, she went on to add that the extra crew members needed to be taken from the reserve crew list. And after checking her figures, she went on to say that this would mean that a further 50,000 places would not be available for the general public. The committee then took a vote on the matter and all agreed that this proposal was acceptable. And when Minister Goodson asked what about the remaining extra places, it was agreed that after all those people who were on the reserve list had been allocated a place, then any remaining places would be allocated to the general public, again by means of a secret lottery. Chancellor Harman then turned to Minister Goodson and said, Minister Goodson, I suggest you and Minister Dagmar run the lottery together. That way, when it's completed, you can quickly contact those who have been chosen and transport them along with the others to the launch sites. And do not forget, the second lottery has to be completed within the next 2 darsecs. Yes, Chancellor, they both replied, and as the Chancellor turned to leave, he said, Remember, Tech, we have only 5 more darsecs to complete this evacuation. So as someone I once knew was fond of saying, the clock is ticking. And with that, Chancellor Harman left the room, leaving behind him a group of very stunned ministers. So it was that over the next 5 days, thousands of the chosen ones, as history would remember them as, congregated at their designated pickup points. And as you can imagine, not one of them was late in getting there. And once they had all arrived, they were then transported in secret to each of the various launch sites spread out around the country. Each one of these sites had been built in an isolated location and well away from prying eyes, allowing the highest security to be maintained from the very start, with the result that the construction of the ships had gone unnoticed by the public at large, and so most of the Mimetic population had thankfully remained unaware of their existence. Most of the construction workers and their families had been there from the very start and had lived in small towns around the launch sites, and the only time any new workers had been brought in was when someone had been killed or had been too badly injured to continue working. Also, any worker who was badly injured was kept on at the site, along with the families of anyone who was killed, and those people were given simple tasks to do and told that they would still retain their places on the ship. And although this was partly done in gratitude, it was really done to maintain security. This possibility that some workers could be killed while working on the job had been taken into account when allocating those pre-selected places, and so it was agreed that to prevent the overall number of places available on any given ship being exceeded, they would only replace any worker killed with people who had no other family members who would have to be left behind. Fortunately, as it turned out, this number of workers who were killed was quite small. Therefore, on the 5th day after that final committee meeting, at around 6 o'clock in the morning, all those who had been selected started to arrive at their designated pickup points, and as you can imagine, not one of them arrived late. Waiting to take them onto their designated launch sites was a fleet of dark green buses, and even though these buses were electric powered so as to come and go quietly, to maintain security, Gan Goodison's agents had put up notices in every area where there was a pickup point, and these notices basically said that the government had organised a sponsored trip, and if they had not been selected for this trip, they would be selected to go on one of the next two. Of course, owing to the fact that it was so early in the morning, there were not that many people about anyway to see these buses as they came and went. As the loading of each bus was completed, it quickly made its way to its designated launch site. And as they approached the launch site, the first thing that the passengers noticed was a very large building at the far end of the site. And once inside the main gate, they were able to see two smaller buildings. As each bus pulled up outside the first of these two smaller buildings, the passengers were quickly moved inside to have their paperwork checked to make certain that no one who did not have the right type of ticket had got onto one of the buses at the pickup point, although because of the strict security, this was extremely unlikely. Then, once a passenger's paperwork had been completed, they were moved on to the second building, which was the secure area, and when everyone in that first group had been processed, they were put onto shuttle buses and taken out to the main building to board the ship via a stairway underneath the ship. Meanwhile, as this group boarded the ship, another group of buses had arrived, and the process had started all over again. Even as the passengers continued to board the ship, a fleet of large grey trucks were starting to arrive with large quantities of stores and other essentials such as tools, food, stuffs, medical equipment and spare parts, which was required for the journey to Germain, as well as to support them during those first few years after they arrived. These supplies, unlike the passengers, was loaded on board via the teleport system, and the reason why the passengers had not been loaded this way was because, owing to the rush to complete the building of the ships, no one was sure how well the teleport system would work, and so they did not want to gamble with the passengers' lives. As it turned out, it worked perfectly. At the launch site, which had been designated Government 1, or G1, Chancellor Harman and the rest of his government ministers, along with anyone else who had been selected for that ship, which was named Brandon, were safely on board and awaiting the launch order. As Chancellor Harman took his seat on the bridge of the Brandon, apart from the few crew, most of the passengers were being placed in their stasis pods, while at the same time the rest of the government and their families were being taken to the launch site designated Government 2 or G2. But unlike the normal passengers, these government passengers bypassed the paperwork checks and went straight to the ship, which was named Blue Stark. And so, like Brandon, the boarding of this ship was completed very quickly. Even as the boarding of the Brandon and Blue Stark was being completed, the rest of the fleet were being completed with the same speed and efficiency. And so by the time the sun sank below the horizon and darkness had started to fall, all the passengers on every ship were safely in stasis, and their respective captains were ready and waiting for the Chancellor Harman to give the command to lift off. On the Brandon, Captain Pontus Brackley, after contacting the rest of the fleet, turned to Chancellor Harman and said, "The fleet is ready to go, Chancellor. All I need is for you to give the word." Chancellor Harman looked at Captain Brackley for a moment as if he was wanting to say something of historical importance, but being unable to think of anything, he simply said, "The word is given, Captain." And with that, the evacuation of the planet Tamaron began, and slowly, one by one, the 3,500 ships of the Mimitech fleet all across Puntona lifted up from their respective launch sites to meet up in orbit around the now dying planet. This trip up to orbit took just over 12 minutes to achieve, but for the people on board the many different ships, it must have seemed more like 12 hours until they were safely orbiting the planet and the tremendous roar of the engines finally came to a stop. Once every ship was finally in orbit, Chancellor Harman then contacted the captain of each ship and was relieved to find that everything had gone off almost without a problem. I say almost because at the site designated S23, the secret had got out at the very last moment, and an angry mob from the nearby town of Strandburn had tried to storm the site, but the troops of Minister Goodson had held the mob back just long enough for the ship to be launched. But regrettably, as the mob tried to storm the ship, a number of them were killed by Minister Goodson's troops as they retreated back to the ship. Plus, as the last of Minister Goodson's troops boarded the ship and the doors slammed shut behind them, a large group started to congregate around the base of the ship, and a number of these were killed by the fireball given off by the downward thrust from the engines as it lifted off. Even so, by the time the evacuation was completed, almost 95% of the Mimitech population had been saved. Once all the ships had finally rendezvoused in orbit, each ship was then allocated a departure number so as to avoid crashing into each other as they entered the inner space corridor, which luckily the Mimitech scientists had discovered about 10 years ago. And when Chancellor Harman had asked Professor Mayday, who was the leading scientist of the day, what was the difference between a wormhole and this inner space corridor, he said that unlike a wormhole, which forms and then later collapses and so is very unpredictable, the inner space corridor is always there, but is invisible to the naked eye. However, it can be detected and entered by a blast of neutron beam. Also, unlike a wormhole, which only links 2 points in space, these inner space corridors crisscross the universe in all directions. He went on to say that these inner space corridors might at best be described as a superhighway outside of normal space. And like a highway, you enter it at one point and follow it to where you wish to go, and then leave it again at your destination. Also, one thing which makes the inner space corridor similar to a wormhole is that it acts as a shortcut across vast distances of space. As Professor Mayday finished his explanation, Chancellor Harman thanked him and nodded as if he had understood every word, which of course he had not. With Chancellor Harmon's ship having been designated as DN1, or Departure Number 1, it meant that by the time that the planet finally ripped itself apart, he was no longer there to see it, as his ship, along with a large part of the fleet, had already entered the inner space corridor. However, some 20 other ships, who unfortunately were still in the process of entering the inner space corridor when the planet exploded, were destroyed by the ensuing blast wave, along with every other form of life still left on the planet, which, as predicted, included 4,000 Mimitek civilians. So it was that the great exodus from Tamaron to the planet Germain had begun. But what no one on the departing Mimitek ships was aware of, because their sensors were offline owing to the radiation being given off by the planet as it entered its final moments, was that the Deliteks and the Militeks had managed to launch a number of ships of their own. I say of their own, but in fact the 57 ships that the Militeks launched, 20 had been stolen from the Deliteks, and of the 150 ships launched by the Deliteks, 47 had been stolen from the Mimitek. Once the Delitek and Militek ships entered the inner space corridor, they took different paths to that of the Mimitek convoy. And although the Deliteks and the Mimitek were destined to meet each other again in the far distant future, in very different circumstances I might add, the Militek race, on the other hand, were never to be seen by the Deliteks ever again. The Mimitek, however, well, that's a different story, best kept for another time.